Welcome to Spiritual Studies, Session 14. This talk is on divination in particular, and a special emphasis on palmistry. This talk takes on the structure of understanding divination in its historical context, and then giving palmistry its historical context as to give us a full, matured, and nuanced perspective on how we should actually interpret these two things, and then describe what palmistry actually is based from a practitioner's standpoint. So in some senses, this will be a how-to, but it's more a guide as to the ideas within divination and palmistry. So first, we have to discuss what divination is. So we start with its etymology, divination, the act of foretelling by supernatural or magical means the future, discovering what is hidden or obscure. Initially, this word divination in Latin meant prediction, simply prediction. Before this, divinus simply means of God. We see this in Sanskrit too, devas, or deus, or dios, meaning God, as it still is pronounced in Latin. And this, of course, goes back to the Proto-Indo-European, meaning to shine. So this all is rooted in the divine, inspiration of the divine. It's only later that this word is associated with prophecy, futures. So in this way, we have to understand immediately that any negative connotations with divination isn't in the root of the word, but is what has been done with the word. So that's an important one. So in order to better understand how the ancients understood divination, I've hand-selected different forms of divination that are both very exotic to us and very relatable to us in strange ways. So all of them generally end with the word mensi. So we'll see this as we go along. But we start with eromancy, air mensi, the craft of air, or divination through interpreting atmospheric conditions. So we could be interpreting shooting stars. We could be interpreting thunder and lightning. We could be interpreting wind or the shapes of clouds. This, in a strange way, is like modern meteorology, the study of weather. So what does the weather look like now? Say about what the weather will be like. So in this way, it's much more mundane seeming than we might assume of a word like divination. But maybe, I can't remember, maybe it was Constantine on the battles seeing a cross in the sky, and this being interpreted as a sign from God that they should continue in the battle. This was aeromancy. This is divination. Or again, we could be more mundane with it. I see that the clouds are turning darker. That particular hue of darker indicates lightning. God, show me a sign. And then meteor showers begin, right? seemingly mundane. So that's one more classical example. So this one's kind of funny because it's called eluromancy, but this type of divination is messages written on paper and inserted into dough. Now, this might sound strange, but this is fortune cookies. This is a type of divination. Um, the chances of you receiving that particular message on that particular day might just line up in a way that actually makes something very significant to you. Now, this is mostly a seeming gag, for most people. It's kind of cliche, but this is, whether it's dry and dull or not, this is a divination. Now, a big one, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but astrology. Astrology and astronomy, by definition, are acts of divination. You have the cycles of how the planets move, and you know where they will be at certain times. And this is the farmer's almanac. This is taboo. People accept this. Farmers depend on this. They always have. So it could lead to a big discussion on what astrology is, but even just noting astronomy and people accepting that as a science, that is, it's divination. You can, if you're if you're tracking the trajectory of a comet, or tracking the trajectory of where a planet is moving and how moons orbit, where it will be when, knowing that the eclipse is coming ahead of time, this, by definition, by fortune, or by future telling, is, and of the heavens, right, by its etymology, this is divination. Another taboo that people just accept and they don't associate with some magical type of divination is gematria. And this is the Hebrew numerology. It's the decoding of the Bible in the means of numbers. This is something that is religiously acceptable and notable and respectable, quite seemingly ingenious as well. And this is not viewed as demonic or anything like that. And in the same way, by extension, numerology. Somebody notices that they like a certain number for some reason. Some people are attracted to even numbers. Some people are attracted to odd numbers. Some people are attracted to very specific numbers, or they realize that they've seen the same number over and over and over again. It always presents itself to them in strange ways. This is numerology. This is a sign. And see, this is the theme I'm trying to establish. It's as if it's saying something to you. Okay, so what is it saying? This is divination. So, there's a lot to look into numerology. Depending on how deep you want to go, you can judge how much integrity is in that craft. But there's definitely a lot. You can dissect names. You can dissect codes. You can dissect how many letters you have in each of your names. That's a wormhole to go through. So a big one that bleeds more into a topic that's going to come up in the future, ESP, but is technically divination, is all forms of clairsentience. So the one that people know is clairvoyance, and this is having visions, of being able to see the future, that you get a flash from the future. This is clairvoyance. Clairsentience is just any form of paranormal sensing. So in this way, you can have clairaudience, which is by modern society recorded very sufficiently in like schizophrenics. But if you heard like the voice of God, or something told you to not go there, this would be, maybe that this clairaudience doesn't happen all the time, but maybe you have a profound experience in life that your sign, your extra normal experience took the form of this word, clairaudience. You also have precognition, which is literally kind of like, it's basically like clairvoyance, where you can see the future play itself out in the past while you're living it. Or you have psychometry, which is being able to feel an object and perform divination through the object. You see this in a lot of TV shows where there is a psychic attempting to solve a crime. They have to like touch the knife or something like that, or they touch the necklace of somebody and they know a bunch of information about them. All of these are worthy of, a lot more discussion. But this is just to say that even simple things such as hearing, seeing, and touching are different forms of divination. If you receive information that is outside of the mundane stimulus that you should be receiving, that you feel something or see something or hear something that's more significant and inexplicable, this is a form of divination by extension of its definition. So moving on, another kind of funny one is cyclomancy, and this is divination through interpreting the spinning of the bottle. It used to be more like of turning the wheel, and seeing where it lands, but kind of like a roulette situation. But yeah, this spinning of the bottle before it got turned into an excuse, for teenagers to whatever, right? Was a tool for making decisions, of discerning directions, of putting the universe in a situation to give you a response. So that one's kind of seemingly silly, but yet again, it could be a form of divination. Now, one that isn't immediately assumable is futurology. And this is an academic discipline. I mean, there are people that meet together as a type of think tank, and individuals that their positions and their study is to notice the trends of what is currently happening in order to make educated guesses as to the future. And yet again, this is technically divination. They are using things, they're using a type of thinking, a type of rationale, in order to discern what will come. Divination. Another fascinating one, in my mind, is geomancy. So this is divination by interpreting the lines and figures traced in the earth, either by reading or feeling out the vibes of pebbles or sand or dirt, to interpret these things in order to discern the future or things that have happened. So Earth's natural formations. This might sound kind of obscure, but this is geology. Literally geology. So if you knew, and mind you, I'm completely aware that they use this type of divination more minutely to be able to, look at the shapes of specific stones in order to gain a lot of understanding. That's one thing, sure. But also to have a relationship with the land as a geologist does, or as somebody who is much more integrated with the earth. And in order to understand how the history has played out, how old this basalt is, how long ago the sandstone's been here, all these things would give you indications of what is in the future to come still. We might associate this with a more scientific mind, but yet again, we are using a means to predict the future. So geomancy. We also have another thing that is surprisingly more accepted than people would think, and this is graphology. And yet again, this is a type of divination deriving information from the form of somebody's handwriting. They use this in forensics uh, for a few reasons. They use it to be able to discern somebody's attitude by their handwriting, what characteristics they have to help them establish motives and to further the case. And of course, they use it to match people's identities, to make sure that forgeries aren't happening. But this handwriting, there's a tremendous amount of old literature that would be able to tell you of rudimentary characteristics of an individual based on the form of their handwriting. This was a very common understanding. It's not foo-foo, it's not superstitious. This is just something that's become more niche as time has gone on. It was a little bit more ubiquitous in the past, but now it seems like a real novelty in that really only those very specific forensics people are familiar with it. But there's a lot that you can discern, a lot of information that you can tell about somebody's past and future and their present attitude, philosophies, desires, yearnings, from their handwriting alone. Now, when I speak of divination, the part that kind of freaks people out is more along the lines of what I'm going to talk about now. So it's ichthoyomancy. It's called ichthoyomancy, which is divination based off the entrails of fish. And there's a lot of these really obscure seeming types of divination that people of the more rational minds cackle at when it comes to the past. But yeah, this was a form of divination in the past. There was allegedly a lot to be able to discern from the specific spill out of fish entrails. You know, that might seem absurd to us, but we don't know the cultural context here. We don't know exactly what the rationale was. And then any of these would seem just as absurd to them that we think is reasonable as we think this method is. So, you know, mind your cultural relativism here. The other one that is much more familiar and is obscure, that generally gives people the bad association of divination, is necromancy. Of course, necromancy, necro meaning dead. And this is not conjuring the dead to come back to life. This is communication with the dead in order to learn things of the past, the present, the future. This was something that was obviously taken up in the spiritualist movement significantly. But as I've noted in previous talks before, this is something that has been tied to shamanism since before any religions have ever propagated on the earth. This is not something as strange as what people might assume, based off of history, not based off of the taboos as they've been passed down by years and years and years of European Catholicism and indoctrinating everybody's ways of thinking. So, you know, again, check your privilege there. I'm not saying that that's something that everybody should do, but I'm just saying we should be mindful of our reactions. But yes, that is a very notable form of divination that spanned many cultures in the past. I'm not going to try to pronunciate this one, but essentially it's the divination of the umbilical cord. When someone came out, you know, when you're born, you could be judged, or your future could be judged, what sort of fate you had based off of the shape of your belly button, based off of if there were knots in your umbilical cord, based off the shape of the umbilical cord itself, any blemishes or the color of it. um, yeah, it could determine how many children a woman would have in her lifetime. There were information that you could garner from something that seems so, again, mundane. That's another forgotten divination. Another one that we really don't think of is in the past, there was the divination of dreams. You know, these are visions. We call it dream interpretation now, and there's a whole kind of field that's on the outer edge of psychology, popularized by Jung. But divination is completely possible within your dreams. You know, there was this kind of belief that you could have, and still to this day somewhat, that you could have a vision of the future, that you could get hints of what was to come, or you could prevent it. Again, this is not something that you choose, in which a lot of these you're attempting to gain knowledge through whatever actions you're doing, you know, spinning the bottle. But in this case, this is a type of divination or sign from the, you know, extraordinary end of reality, telling you of something. So interesting, you know, interesting one. And I've got just three more, and I want to spend a little bit of time on this. But it's called dowsing, or divining, or water witching, and this one has been really uh, negatively done over time. This is a very common practice. They also have a few other words for it: water finding, water witching, water dowsing, doodle bugging. This, you know, you would most of the time use it to look for water, but it was later appropriated to look for oil. Now, what I want to say about this is two things. The general shape of this would be that they're using a Y-shaped twig or rod, or that they would use an L-shaped twig or rod, and that they would kind of use this. They would call it a vining rod, or a witching rod, and they would use this as a means to feel out. They would use no other equipment. They would use this as a means to feel out where the water was underground and where you could dig a well. And so this might seem silly, and many people would call this a tremendous pseudoscience that only worked out of sheer luck, just by the fact that there was so much water around that they would just so happen to point out where it is. Now, the story that I want to say is out in the Pacific Northwest, of which, you know, I live, and this is a reference point. I live in this place called Kashmir, and one of my neighbors, one of the old souls that have been here for a long time, they were having a real hard time finding their first water supplies here. They wanted to build a house a bit further off the beaten trail, and for the life of them, they were hiring contractors and contractors and contractors to strike water underneath this property so that they could have their own system. And they wasted, they said, just over $100,000 trying to get these contractors, these sciency types, to find it, and they were utterly failing. And this is actually the first time I ever heard of a witcher or water witching. And he told me that he finally relented. And, you know, as a last ditch effort, he was like, okay, you know, I'm going to try the Witcher. And this Witcher had been local, and he had quite the reputation among people for doing exactly that, finding water where there seemed to be none. And of course, as you might expect, he hires him, comes up, and he finds it first try, and everything's resolved. And he said, you know, I don't know why I didn't go with him to begin with. So don't knock it till you try it. Honestly, um, uh, that's a personal testimony that's been passed to me. Um, all right, two more. Uh, Very notable is zoomancy, and this is what we call totems, and I mentioned it, I think, last session. The divination through what animals present themselves to you, and or how they behave. So all animals have totems. Um, if there is an animal that you've never really seen, and here's the difference: you might see a lot of animals, you might see a lot of birds, you might see a lot of weasels, you might see a lot of rats, but here's the thing: if the animal presents itself to you in a way that's very notable, in a way that captures your eye, in a way that seems intentful, somebody might just call this a sign from God. But this is what we're talking about. This is divination. You're getting a sign of something that seems extraordinary, that's seeming to say something to you, that's seeming to give you more information than the mundane fact of seeing an animal. So every animal carries its own messages. Um, One time when I was driving in Idaho, uh, all of a sudden, never had seen one before, but a gray bluish fox presented itself to me in the road. It didn't just walk by; it literally stretched itself out to me in a very notable fashion, and I took this seriously. So for some people, it's very. It could be an owl, it could be a coyote. It could literally, it could be a moose. Um, yeah. So it's just another way of being mindful of what messages might be being brought to you, especially if you believe in God or anything above the like anything that's involving the collective consciousness. So the last one I want to mention is scrying, and this takes many, many forms. So this one is what people would recognize if they watch like old witchy movies and series. You've got scrying through water. You've got smoke scrying. You've got mirror scrying. You know, people using mirrors for discerning the future or gaining visions or so forth. The one that people know best is the crystal ball. This is also scrying. Look into my crystal ball. You can also use a utensil that dangles from your finger, that points in certain directions, either clockwise or counterclockwise for yes and for no. So this is one of the most various forms of divination. And again, it's just a way of testing what wants to be seen and what's willing to show itself to you as a conversation between you and the collective consciousness, or whatever you want to call it. So we're officially done with me giving this kind of smorgasbord explanation of what divination is. And I think all of that is worth it, because now we can look at divination and mind you, this is just a snippet. There's so many more types, but this gives us the feeling of the true breadth of what divination is. Yes, some of it seems occult, some of it seems very unrelatable, but also a lot of divination is ingrained into our culture. We just don't call it divination, even though it is. So now we are going to start talking about palmistry as a focus point of a type of divination. So palmistry is a lot older than people might interpret. You've got, and I think this is the form of where it starts to where, well, okay, anyway, you find it in India, Nepal, you find it in Tibet, you find it in Persia, you found it in Sumeria, you found it in Babylon, you found it in ancient Israel, and you find it in China. This is a fairly well spread phenomena that transcends different cultures. You have prehistoric paintings of just hands, people's hands, this fascination with hands. Um, and it would seem that since the very inception of man, of what we're told of man's history, there's been this fascination with the hand in artistic renderings. You have archaeological discoveries of hands made of ivory, hands made of wood, hands made of stones, in all different forms of both named and unnamed civilizations, ancient civilizations. You have this case of 3000 BC, so what, 5,000 years ago, where the emperor of China was sealing documents with his thumbprint, putting ink on his thumbprint. You have all these different historical figures that you wouldn't imagine that studied palmistry or participated with palmistry or divination discerned through the hands. They call it chiromancy, by the way. But you had Aristotle write a treatise on palmistry. You had a kind of dedication to Hermes, which is this inscription on stone that was this big old writing of palmistry. You have you know, Julius Caesar judging all of his men and selecting his men by use of palmistry. This seems to go back to Hindu astrology, and yes, when you're talking about real deep knit palmistry, it is tied to astrology. We'll get more to that later. When you're talking about in China, it has a lot to do with the history of the I Ching, which is a tremendous topic. Probably go over that one day. But what is most popular and what people think about palmistry is the Romanian fortune tellers. And this is the story of the gypsies. And this is a very rough story, but essentially that they were a type of people originally home in India, and that where they're living in India, they were so good at their future telling of showing people their true characteristics that they got kicked out by the bourgeoisie because they wouldn't tell them what they wanted to hear. They would only tell them the truth. And they didn't like this. So they got kicked out and they had to migrate as a people. And they moved to Egypt, eventually making their way to Egypt. And the same sort of thing happened. They were so good at this particular craft that they had formed as a tradition that the rulers kicked them out. And so they moved again, you know, they moved again, and eventually they would become what we call Romanian. Um, uh, and this ascribes to the kind of stereotype of the wandering gypsy, the transient gypsy. And this wasn't chosen per se. This is something that has been historically imbibed into the culture. And that's not to say that they're all like that. It's not to say that none of them are like that. But that's the general story. So at the very least, we have several thousand years of history of palmistry. This goes way, 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 way back to an undiscernible point of the past. We don't know exactly where it begins, but we have plenty of ancient records by the Hindus in India. And we see it all across Europe, and we see it all across Asia. So very, very notable. In Greece, as you know, popular names go, Anaxagoras, he was a pre-Socratic philosopher. That's the name that practiced it. You got Aristotle, I think I mentioned. You also had Alexander the Great. You know, he had great interest in discerning his officers by analyzing the lines on their hands. So again, very integrated into the past. Across the board. Now, just like in our witch talk, you can already guess how this goes. So in the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church comes to power, and they consider palmistry a pagan superstition. And this was classified as one of the 7 forbidden arts. The forbidden arts would be hunted down by the Inquisition, by all the claims of heresy. If you want to know more about this time period in the past, just go to my talk on the burning times. But for our purposes, the 7 forbidden arts is, you know, palmistry, geomancy, which we mentioned, you know, aeromancy, which we mentioned, pyromancy, which is discerning fire, hydromancy, which is water, and then, you know, spatulamancy, which is divination through bones, which is not one I mentioned, but is another one that kind of freaks people out. You know, most commonly shoulder bones as used as a form of divination. So all of palmistry, these other forms of divination, and a lot of forms of the ancient past, including astrology, but we're not talking about that right now, all were forced underground by the Catholic Church, discerning all of this as devil worshiping. And without getting too far into why this happens and the philosophy of why this happened, suffice it just to say that anything that potentially would lead one to the old traditions, no matter how seemingly innocuous, no matter how seemingly innocent, had to be done away with to maintain the power of the church. Not the truth of what Christianity is, but the power of the church. And they needed any reasons that they could find to vindicate people and to show an example to keep other people in line. So don't, as a practitioner of palmistry or say like tarot, when you see Christians that shy away from this, calling this demonic, it is nothing more than propaganda that has been passed down for hundreds of years. There are no grounds tying it to the demonic. That's nonsense. If they actually knew the arts of this tradition of our human history, then they would know better than to say such things. Okay, rant is over. These people were killed for knowing these things, for practicing these things. Until you had other names that kind of brought it back after the church kind of dissolved in its power. Paracelsus was a big one. Fluid was another big one. This guy, Dr. Karras, has another big one. He was a physician in the 19th century that would use palms in his basically his doctoring. Advances and studies in palmistry would be tied to the early scientific movement. So there have been legitimate studies that have shown that the hands are indications of genetics, psychology, and of course they use it in forensics. This continues into the modern age. We just don't call it palm reading. It's kind of relegated to other things that are viewed as acceptable by the general culture. But as soon as 1901, Scotland is the one that started the technique of fingerprinting for criminal identification. Again, hands. What's up with hands? Hands as the way to identify somebody. Medical researchers, as I sort of mentioned, found that skin patterns correspond with genetic abnormalities, unusual markings on the hands. Research has found that certain fingerprint patterns indicate heart disease. These things are scientifically provable. These things are empirically true. Okay, so if you think pseudoscience, again, recontextualize. So professional palmists can be found all around the world. The negative thing here is that we not only have the propaganda and the fear mongering that moved from the Inquisition and searching for heretics of the 600 years ago, but we also have the negative associations with what people did during the spiritualist movement when they tried to exploit people for money, using spiritual things or things that are perceived as spiritual to pull the wool over people's eyes in order to exploit them for money. And this is unfortunate because it undermines the credibility of what is actually an art form and what is actually something that you can discern a lot of knowledge from. So this has been something, think of a good person who's been unfairly given a bad reputation. So I'm going to spend the rest of the time here giving you a kind of practitioner's understanding of what palmistry is and what it isn't. Okay, so we have to start first with that discussion of the fascination of human hands in cave paintings. The hands are uniquely human. Our ability to articulate with them is what makes us codified as human, because the only other thing that has the opposable thumbs are certain forms of monkeys, right? So the ability to articulate and to use the particular nature of the hands to craft is what has given us the ability to use tools, is what has given us the ability to make things, to craft, and civilization as a result. Think of 2001 Space Odyssey, you know, it starts with the monkey using the bone as a tool of war, and then it goes to a spaceship up in the sky. I mean, this has everything to do with our hands. So in a very real way, you can say our hands are very divine, they're very godly. A lot of our power has to do with our hands. It's strange. And to give an analysis, I mentioned briefly earlier that astrology is tied to the hands. And yes, that is a way that you can understand it. But if we're going to explain this philosophy, and mind you, too, before I continue in any of this, I'm not saying this is what you should believe about astrology. I'm not saying that any of the, or about palmistry. I'm not saying that you should subscribe completely to the philosophy that I'm giving, but I'm saying this is a philosophy of understanding the nuance of it. Take from it what you will. But the four fingers on top, from pointer to pinky, are ascribed to different planets, or constellations technically. The pointer for Jupiter, the middle finger for Saturn, the ring finger for Apollo, and the pinky finger for Mercury. These are viewed as the celestial powers. So every animal, or every type of animal, has these energic influences. They think of the fingers and of claws, of toes and such, as antennae of energic or auric proportion that negotiate with this aura. Now, without the thumb, this would give us claws, and this would make us purely instinctual beings. And with the thumb, however, and a certain form of a corpuscle within our thumbs that aren't found in monkeys, this gives us a different type of appeal. And the thumb is the will. So that's the thing that makes things different by the philosophy of astrology, or God, I keep saying astrology, palmistry, is the fact that the thumb makes us able to control or manipulate or craft with the celestial powers that are given to all things. So that is the minute difference in the story of the hands in this way. This is what gives us our ingenuity. This is what gives us our identity, is our will and our ability to craft with our articulate capabilities. Okay, so there's a foundation for you. Now, when it comes to more kind of scientific proof, or ways that you can kind of believe a genuine reader, you know, again, discerning between a shyster and a genuine reader, um, is a matter of neurons. Okay, so it is physiologically true that there are more neural connections, or nerve connections, between your brain and your hands than anywhere else in the body. This seems plain and simple, but there are many implications to this. So what happens in your brain physiologically, and its shape, its health, and all these things, is tied to the hands. The hands are thought of as a mirror, or a representation of the brain in accordance to how many connections there are. So for example, a good example of this is the padding that is where your hand meets your thumb, or where your palm meets your thumb. The amount of padding there is equivocable in the mind of the palmistry reader to your ability of empathy. In the brain, this is called mirror neurons. And so physiologically, this is a thing, mirror neurons, of which represent themselves in the hand by the level of padding beneath the thumb. This seems like a hooey connection, but again, with how many connections there are between the two, you would think that there would be a physical representation, or a way of considering this. So this is a way that somebody discerns how empathic somebody is, how connected they are, and the lack of it would show one's tendencies toward sociopathy, and other like general lack of humanizing others, coldness. And in addition, you can look at one's circulation through their hands by either the hue of their fingertips, or by certain colorations or certain markings that appear in order to discern if somebody's heart is unhealthy, in order to discern if somebody is starting to form jaundice and have like liver failure potential. There are different ailments, different types of illnesses and impending diseases that can be discerned or indicated. That's the big word, indicated by the hands. And certain there's more foo-foo literal markings that can be seen in the body of the palm itself that would be a more direct read to say when and so forth, but not all palmists subscribe to that. But yet again, what I'm trying to prove here is that as a physician, and especially early physicians, the art of palmistry is useful. It's not pseudoscience. It's not um, nonsense. It's not superstition. There is an art to it. There is a tradition to it. There is a reason to it. There is physiological, scientific proof that goes along with it. And if anything, if you don't want to give it too much credit, you can think of it as a quick code check on a person's well-being. By being able to know how to discern the hands. Now, here's where we have to dive into the foo-foo end of things, which is the philosophy of palmistry. So there's a few assumptions that go into a reading, or how a reader approaches their clients, their participants. And there is essentially two types of people. There are fated people, people who have a fate, and then there are people without a fate, or free-willed people. This is to say that every human being had a pre-existence of which they decided what they were in for in life. And some people decided to come in freely. They said, just sign me up for the ride, or put me where you need me. And then other people, if we're taking an Indian approach, or Hindu approach, they came with karma. But another approach is to say that they came to life with a bullet point list, and there was certain people, certain things to do, certain jobs to have, certain places to be. So they signed themselves up for a fate. This could either be wanting to learn certain lessons through providing a structure in life, or this could be a subservience of paying somebody back, of giving yourself a fate of servitude towards a certain ideal, or towards a certain soul tribe, or towards a certain individual. So this is not what is necessarily believed by all palmists, but this is a way of interpreting when it comes to the more philosophical, larger stretching answers in palmistry. So in this way, there is a tremendous discussion of what divination can we do? And this is the interesting point of this talk. Can palmistry really tell you what is going to happen in the future? Because in order to say what will happen in the future with any form of divination, that immediately is philosophically stating that it's fatalism, or the divine plan, that there is one way that everything is going to work out for everybody, and there is no free will whatsoever. If you're asking to be told the future in any form, this is a tremendous philosophical leap. So I had a lady who was neurotically asking me if she was going to die young, because she was very concerned that she would die, that she didn't want to have children if she was going to die young. If she was going to have children, she wanted to live long. This was a tremendous concern for her. And that is not something that I believe any palmist by studying the tradition, can answer without without a doubt. They can answer that and give the answer that they want to hear for money's sake. And that's a whole nother play. But as a genuine practitioner, you can have indications that somebody will be of poor health. This is true. To make the leap that this will result in early death is big. That's a big leap. Because basically, when discerning the future, if you are seeing multiple signs that point to one conclusion, then you can say that probability is high. Not 100%, but probability is high. And in my understanding, the philosophy of palmistry is that we can change things, okay? People think that their hands are solid, that the lines don't change. This is not true. Your dominant hand's lines will change as long as you live. Your non-dominant hand can't guarantee that. Although it might, and that's another interesting case, but we're not spending time with that. So it's a mix between free will and fatalism. If we choose a certain path in life and we don't change anything, things will go a certain way for us. We can predict on this line. But with our will, we can change what way we're going in life. And this will change our future. So some people have more choice and some people have less choice in this. So this is all a great way for me to wrap back to the point of divination, of which we've been speaking with at the beginning, since the beginning. So as palmistry as an example, what I'm trying to say is there are signs in something as simple as your hands that you might not ever question that can tell you all sorts of things. It can tell you about your health. It can give you your tendencies of how things will go based off of your characteristics of who you are now and nothing more. It might also give you indications of who you may become. These things are not rigid, in my perspective as a practitioner. So you can have signs. You can learn things. Some things that seem more foo-foo, some things that seem more literal. And in all forms of divination, whether you see an animal, that seems very significant, or maybe, something, let's make it a little bit more translatable. Maybe you see somebody in a crowd that really reminds you of somebody who's long been dead. They really look like them. And this to you would seem like a very significant event. This would be a very purposeful thing that you would remember very strongly. This is divination. This is, or I should say, this is the feeling of divination. This is as it takes its form in many different ways. Telling the future is a tricky prospect, of which is involved in divination. You could have a dream and not ask for it and learn things of the future. Maybe. That's involuntary. You could finally feel, I've had this experience, and I hope that you all have an experience that you relate to something that I've shared with today. But I had an experience where I saw a person, a woman that I was with, and I knew exactly how things were going to play out. I saw it all happen ahead of time. And, well, not saw it. I should say I felt it. I felt how it was going to go. I hope this doesn't make me sound too insane. And I tried to do everything in my power to negate that because I very much wanted to hold on to this. And it ended up being me not accepting it and not letting go, ended up making all the terrible things I felt come true. That might seem like an argument for fatalism, by the way, too. And I do understand this is very soupy and confusing, generally ambiguous topic and such deep things. But sometimes we just get these signs. Something slaps us across the face. It can take the form of water, It can take the form of a sign in the earth, um, a study of geography. It could take the sign of a cloud, you know. It could take, I mean, people use bones. It could be anywhere. That's the point. It could be numbers. Numbers, like they're not even real. I mean, they are, but come on, we're not going there right now. People would do bibliomancy. They would, when they needed a sign, they would just, oftentimes it was a Bible, but oftentimes they'd also use a poetry book. They would just flip through it, and in the first sentence they see, that was the thing that was supposed to guide them on their way. Or like, you know, where should I go? And they spin the globe and they see where it stops, or they throw a dart at it, or at a map. You know, these are all ways that we kind of, um, it's not freaky, you know, there's nothing occult, there's nothing witchy, most notably there's nothing demonic about it. It's a way of conversating with the greater unknown that you view as outside of yourself, but on another level is the greater you, the you with a capital Y, or the collective consciousness, or whatever you want to call it. People can call it God. um, you know, it's this communication with a knowing that seems beyond yourself, since we're so convinced of our, you know, existential predicaments. So divination in this way, I'd say you have practiced it in different forms, you have experienced it in different forms, it comes to you, and there are other forms where people seek the divination. um, you can't squeeze it dry. You can't get all the answers from different forms of divination. I know a lot of people would like to seem very powerful in their understanding of, like, say, palmistry or other forms of divination. But the truth is, you can learn things, but you can't learn everything. If you're looking for certainties, this world isn't for you, no matter what means you're going to try to employ. Um, but there are answers. I mostly wanted to give this talk to enlighten people on this subject, but also to break the taboos, certain things that you thought you had all figured out. I encourage you to look deeper into it, gain your own understanding through critical thought, through your own actual study. Don't believe what you were told on these subjects. We've inherited a very negative interpretation. All right, I'm done for this time.